The comment by Zelensky that President Trump, much as we respect him, unfortunately is trapped in a disinformation bubble is actually pretty apt. But when you're dealing with thin-skinned narcissists, it's very risky to rub their noses in it.
President Zelensky is due to meet President Trump's special envoy to Ukraine and Russia in Kyiv today. This is a day after that row between the Ukrainian and American leaders threatened to derail diplomatic efforts towards peace talks. Let's bring in Leigh Turner, former British ambassador to Ukraine and author of a book called Lessons in Diplomacy, Politics, Power and Parties. Leigh Turner, good afternoon to you.
Yeah, good afternoon. I've been wondering if somebody could send a copy of that book to the president, actually.
Well, surely you can do it yourself. Come on, Mr. Turner.
Excellent plan. Thank you.
OK. Well, there's your weekend sorted. So, honestly, what have you made of the last 24 hours or so?
It's been extraordinary, hasn't it, really? We've seen President Zelensky. I thought for the first week after this extraordinary torrent of pro-Russian chaos began coming out of the White House, that statement by Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary at the Munich Security Conference, and then the announcement that Trump had just spoken to Putin on the phone for 90 minutes. Throughout all of this, Zelensky has been rather diplomatic. He's kept a low profile. He's tried not to criticize Trump. But when Trump repeated propaganda from Moscow saying that Ukraine started the war, something seems to have snapped. And if you ask me, the comment by Zelensky that President Trump, much as we respect him, unfortunately is trapped in a disinformation bubble is actually pretty apt. But when you're dealing with thin-skinned narcissists, it's very risky to rub their noses in it. And now Trump has doubled down, attacking Zelensky, calling him a dictator, saying he'd better move fast or he won't have a country left. This is straight out nonsense.
Yeah,
but
well,
underlines the need to do something now.
Would we? Do you think you would just be able to tell us when you were the British ambassador to Ukraine? And just for anyone listening who thinks, well, this man, Leigh Turner, he's kind of swallowed the Ukrainian kool-aide. He's clearly on their side. When were you there? And what do you think of the place as a country?
So I was actually posted in Moscow from 1992 to 1995, so I have a lot of time for Russia and the Russians too. And then I was posted as ambassador in Ukraine from 2008 to 2012. And one of the key things about Ukrainians is that they're very much different from the Russians. Although some Ukrainians do speak Russian in the east of the country mostly, that no more makes them Russian than the fact that people in Ireland speak English makes them English. And it's a very different place, very different vibes, much more westernized, much more democratic, and really a country which in the 30 plus years since the end of the Soviet Union has developed a very clear identity, and one that for many people who have a lot to do with Ukraine is very attractive.
Right. Well, that's pretty clear, and thank you for that. What do you think the dynamic will be between Keith Kellogg and the people he's meeting in Kyiv? We should say that Mr. Kellogg, I think, has at least one family member who works for a charity, runs a charity that helps Ukrainian veterans, which suggests that he is likely to be sympathetic to the Ukrainian cause.
Well, General Kellogg is, in theory, the President Trump's envoy to solve the Ukraine-Russia war, but he's been taking rather a low profile over the last week. Before that, Kellogg, on a number of occasions, said quite sensible things about this conflict, including the need for Ukraine to be able to negotiate from a position of strength. So I think it'll be very interesting to see what he says to Zelensky. I don't know if we'll find out exactly what's passed between them, but it's absolutely essential, in my view, that everybody who's dealing with the Americans makes clear to them, and particularly to President Trump, who I think if we're talking about drinking kool-aide, he really has swallowed Putin's kool-aide, makes clear that an outcome to this conflict, which leaves Russia in control of any significant amount of Ukraine, is equivalent to Russia winning the war. And if Russia wins the war, this is going to store up huge long-term problems, not just for Europe, but also for US security. It'll mean that the Russians are emboldened to attack Ukraine again later. It'll mean that the Russians are emboldened to attack somewhere else next time, maybe Moldova, maybe the Baltic states, maybe Kazakhstan. And then, of course, every other tin pot dictator around the world, as John Major said the other day, will be tempted to attack their neighbours too.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you mentioned John Major, because I think it strikes quite a lot of people that he's one of the few people who stood up and said something about this. Where are other former British prime ministers who could say something? I know Boris Johnson did issue a statement yesterday, but what about the Obamas? What about the Clintons? I think Nikki Haley has said something, hasn't she? But there just aren't many people speaking up and speaking out.
Yes, John Major, you've got to admire him, really. He keeps coming up with these common sense interventions. And one of the obvious things that I long for people to say is that President Trump has a lamentable history of sorting out international crises. If we look at his record, in 2018, he tried to negotiate with the North Korean dictator, Kim Jong-un, to sort out nuclear disarmament without consulting anybody. What happened? 7 years later, the North Koreans still have nuclear weapons. Now the Russians are helping them. Same with the Taliban. Trump negotiated with the Taliban over the heads of the Kabul government. 18 months later, Kabul fell. I mean, these are really strange ideas. And I agree with you absolutely. I think that it's time for senior leaders to stand up and be counted, just to give a reality check to this stuff, which really is based on the worst kind of social media disinformation. And unfortunately, that seems to be how President Trump is being advised.
But one would assume that people aren't speaking up because, quite simply, they are scared. And that is in itself frightening.
It is quite frightening. I think we're seeing a situation in the US. I don't follow US domestic politics very closely, but there is absolute chaos breaking out within the US as President Trump's colleague Elon Musk, to whom he has given a big job to cut government expenditure, basically, is wreaking chaos within the US body politic, including closing down things like the Center for Disease Control and attacking the Federal Aviation Authority. And people just don't know what's going on. And it has become almost quite dangerous to speak out. I think people like Obama, for example, or Hillary Clinton, or many other figures who are, as it were, safely retired, can speak out. But Republicans, above all, the kind of sensible wing of the Republican Party, for them, it's really risky to speak out. And we've seen President Trump pardoning, I think, around 1,500 people who stormed the Capitol a couple of years ago. And there's this feeling that the rule of law is not running deep in the United States, which is alarming for all of us.
Well, it absolutely is. And that brings me to the fact that Sir Keir Starmer is due to visit the White House next week. What on earth would you advise him to do and say?
He's got a tough job, hasn't he? I'd be interested also to know what's going on between Keir Starmer and Peter Mandelson, who is the newly appointed British ambassador to Washington, whose job is actually to be a kind of Trump whisperer. And I don't know how he's getting on in getting to grips with the US administration, but I hope he'll be doing some good work and giving Sir Keir some good advice. I mean, what Keir Starmer needs to do is, first of all, to tell President Trump that the UK and the Europeans will step up to the plate to defend Ukraine, that this really matters. But secondly, I think he needs to use all his influence to get under the skin of Trump, to present some facts to Trump about what is going on. And above all, as I said before, to emphasize that a Russian victory in this conflict is not in the security interests of the US. This is craziness. And although Trump feels that he has this deal-making ability and that he can make a deal with Putin over the heads of the Ukrainians and over the heads of the Europeans, and that will somehow be a fantastic deal that he's delivered, there's no evidence at all that Trump is capable of doing that.